The hangar was still, holding the kind of silence that feels heavy like the pause before a storm. Pale inspection lights began to hum overhead, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor. In the center, under the glow, sat the Chengdu J-20 mighty dragon. Not just an aircraft, but a statement. Its presence was undeniable. The matte gray skin absorbed light as if it were swallowing attention itself, every line of its fuselage cut with purpose. At 20.4 meters in length and nearly 13 meters in wingspan, it didn't just fill space, it owned it. From a distance, the shape looked almost alive, predatory, poised as though it could spring forward without warning. Technicians moved around it in quiet choreography. Their tools clicked softly, every motion precise, every touch deliberate. They were not just maintaining a machine, they were tending to a predator whose survival depended on invisibility. Panels were inspected by hand and flashlight, fingertips tracing along the sharp, angled edges of stealth geometry. A design where every surface had been calculated to scatter radar waves, every contour meant to deny the enemy a clean return signal. The skin itself felt different from that of conventional fighters, smoother in some places, textured in others, as if each square inch had a classified purpose. If you want to see more deep, behind-the-scenes stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next mission. And tell us in the comments, what part of the J-20's design surprised you the most? The canards, positioned ahead of the main delta wings, were at rest now, angled slightly downward like the relaxed claws of a bird of prey. Many outsiders had questioned their presence on a stealth aircraft, but here, up close, their role was clear. These forward surfaces didn't just help with maneuverability, they were tuned for balance, for shaping the air long before it reached the wings. In slow, deliberate movements, a ground engineer adjusted their pitch manually, checking hydraulic response and control alignment. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it was a reminder that in the air, these surfaces would be alive, making constant micro-adjustments invisible to the naked eye, but critical to survival. Beneath the J-20's elongated belly, the internal weapon bay doors were sealed shut. From the outside, there was nothing to see. No missile rails, no bombs, nothing that would betray its purpose. Inside those compartments, however, was the heart of the Dragon's offense. Long-range PL-15 missiles with active radar seekers, capable of reaching targets over 200 kilometers away, and short-range PL-10s equipped with advanced infrared homing, deadly in close quarters. All of it hidden from sight, not to spare aesthetics, but to protect the aircraft's radar cross-section from the kind of exposure that had doomed countless fighters in past conflicts. The air intakes sat on either side of the fuselage, their contours swelling subtly where the diverterless, supersonic inlet design shaped airflow. There were no moving parts here, no traditional ramps or splitter plates like those seen on older fighters. Instead, the bulge and the sharp leading edge redirected turbulent boundary air without the mechanical complexity of legacy designs. It meant fewer moving components to maintain, fewer gaps for radar to exploit, and a cleaner, uninterrupted path for air to feed the twin engines. Watching the technicians check the intake edges, it was impossible not to think of how many hours of wind tunnel testing had been poured into achieving this perfect balance between stealth and efficiency. Every inch of the J-20 carried the weight of its purpose. The placement of antennas was deliberate, the finish of each fastener flush to the surface, the canopy coated with a thin layer of radar-absorbing material. Even the way the nose transitioned into the fuselage was calculated to deflect detection. Not a curve wasted, not an angle without reason. Standing near it, you could almost feel the history pressing in. Decades of aerospace development compressed into a single form, built in a world where air dominance meant survival. One of the senior ground crew members paused his inspection and looked down the length of the aircraft, almost reverently. For him, and for everyone on this floor, the J-20 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a culmination of lessons learned from other nations' mistakes and successes, an answer to a question asked in countless defense briefings. How do you make something that can be seen only when it chooses to be seen? The answer sat here, in matte gray, its edges catching the light in fractured highlights. Somewhere near the nose, a panel was removed to reveal wiring harnesses and cooling lines, the veins and arteries of the J-20's onboard systems. They were neatly bundled, shielded against electromagnetic interference, and color-coded for quick identification. Nearby, another technician checked the seals on the canopy, making sure the pressurization system would hold at extreme altitudes. The smell of heated electronics and aviation fuel began to fill the air, subtle but enough to remind you that this machine was built to move fast, climb high, and do both without hesitation. What struck you most wasn't the size or even the cutting-edge technology. It was the restraint. There was nothing here that didn't serve a purpose. No wasted space, no unnecessary ornamentation. The J-20's beauty was in its function, in the way its form obeyed the cold logic of stealth, speed, and lethality. Even on the ground, with its engines silent, you could feel the tension in its design, like a bow drawn and waiting for the string to snap forward. As the inspection lights shifted and the crew's pace quickened, It became clear that this wasn't just routine maintenance. This was preparation. The aircraft's skin had been checked for imperfections that could compromise stealth, the control surfaces tested for the responsiveness they would need at supersonic speeds, and the weapons bays secured for flight. Soon, the mighty Dragon would no longer be a silent presence in the hangar. It would be airborne, moving through skies where every second and every signal mattered. And as the last tools were put away and the canopy lowered, there was a sense that whatever came next would not just be another flight, but a demonstration of why this machine existed at all. The canopy sealed with a muted hydraulic hiss, the outside world fading to a dim and filtered glow. Inside, the cockpit felt more like the command module of a spacecraft than the cramped confines of a traditional fighter. A hush settled over everything, except the faint hum of electronics waking in a deliberate sequence, each system coming online as if it were part of a living organism. Across the expansive glass panels of the multifunction displays, symbology bloomed into view. Green vectors, amber alerts, thin blue grids. There were no analog gauges here, no dials or needles. Every piece of information was digital, precise, and layered. The pilot wasn't just looking at instruments, he was looking at a curated interpretation of reality. In front of him, the central display pulsed with data from the aircraft's fusion engine, not the kind that powers reactors, but a brain that merges the feeds from radar, infrared sensors, electro-optical cameras, and electronic support measures into a single coherent picture. Instead of managing each sensor individually, the pilot saw only what mattered: threats, opportunities, and the invisible lines of airspace boundaries. It was as if the jet whispered in his ear, "I've already checked everything. Here's what you need to know." In training, this system had caught targets that human eyes would have never spotted in time, merging a faint heat bloom from the IRST with a barely perceptible radar spike, and confirming it as a potential contact before the pilot even realized there was something out there. The helmet's visor projected a ghostly overlay of flight parameters: altitude, airspeed, angle of attack, floating in the pilot's field of vision no matter where he looked. It was an extension of his mind, allowing him to keep his gaze outside, to the horizon, without ever glancing down. The system tracked his eyes, marking points in space with subtle icons. A simple glance could cue a missile seeker or bring up target information in the blink of an eye. In the close-quarters world of air combat, that fraction of a second could mean survival. It was technology born from the relentless pursuit of shaving milliseconds off decision time. He reached to the right console, fingers brushing over the matte-finished controls of the throttle. Twin engines slept quietly for now, but at a touch, they would stir. The WS-10C power plants, fitted with thrust vectoring nozzles, were more than raw muscle. They were tools for precision, able to twist their exhaust to tighten a turn or pitch the nose without rolling the wings. The engineer's solution to combining super maneuverability with stealth had been to recess those nozzles deep within the fuselage and contour the edges to scatter radar returns. It was a compromise between aerodynamics, heat signature suppression, and the unforgiving geometry of low observability. With a thumb press, the engine's start sequence began. A distant growl rose from behind, low at first, then swelling as turbines spun faster. The vibrations came not as a jolt, but as a smooth, insistent presence that filled the cockpit and resonated in the chest. Outside, heat shimmered along the hangar's edge as exhaust gases licked the air. Systems that had been running in standby now shifted into full readiness, their status lights flickering from amber to green in rapid succession. The electrical hum deepened into a richer soundscape, pumps whirring, gyros spinning, cooling systems cycling. It was as though the mighty Dragon had taken its first breath of the day. The nose wheel began to turn, guiding the aircraft slowly toward the hangar's open mouth. Taxiing a fifth-generation stealth fighter wasn't the same as rolling an older jet across the tarmac. The landing gear had to absorb micro-vibrations without transmitting them into the airframe, protecting the delicate calibration of the sensors. The tires, pressure-monitored in real time, were built to withstand the high-speed loads of supersonic landings. But on the ground, they rolled with an almost eerie quietness. Hydraulic steering kept the nose precise on the centerline, and the pilot could feel how every mechanical input had been refined to avoid overcorrection. The control stick, often associated with aggressive pulls and rolls in flight, was now used in delicate flicks, guiding the canards to balance the taxi at slow speeds. As the aircraft moved into the open, the light shifted, reflecting faintly off the canopy's radar-absorbing coating. The world outside looked slightly muted, like it was being filtered through a thin veil, a side effect of the special metallic layer designed to prevent the canopy from becoming a bright target on enemy radar. From this vantage, the pilot could see ground crew trailing alongside, some holding wands to signal clearance, others visually scanning the airframe for anything out of place. Their presence wasn't just procedural, it was another layer of defense against the smallest oversight that could cascade into a mission failure. To his left, a crew chief gave the signal to pause. One final set of checks rolled through the cockpit. The environmental controls were adjusted to balance cockpit temperature against the heat generated by avionics. The oxygen generation system confirmed flow, ensuring the pilot could breathe comfortably even at altitudes where the outside air was unfit for human lungs. Weapon systems were verified, though their bays remained sealed. Even the radar stayed in passive mode, listening to the electromagnetic spectrum rather than broadcasting. There would be a time to speak, but for now, silence was its own weapon. The runway loomed ahead, a strip of asphalt stretching into the horizon. As the taxi continued, the pilot's eyes flicked between the outside world and the symbology on his visor, the two becoming indistinguishable. In the distance, heat haze blurred the line between ground and sky. He eased the throttle forward just enough to feel the aircraft's eagerness to move faster, like a hunting animal straining at the leash. The mighty Dragon was no longer simply being readied. It was awake, alert, and moments away from leaving the Earth behind. The airframe seemed to anticipate the transition from rolling to flying, and the pilot's hands rested lightly on the controls, knowing that very soon the full potential of this machine would be unleashed. And when it was, the quiet of the ground would be replaced by the controlled chaos of combat airspace. The runway stretched ahead like a ribbon of promise, its heat haze blurring into the distant horizon. The pilot held the J-20 steady at the threshold, fingers resting lightly on the throttle levers. Clearance came through the headset, crisp and calm, yet carrying the weight of everything that would follow. With a deliberate push, the twin WS-10C engines roared to life in full thrust, their deep vibration flooding through the airframe. Acceleration was immediate, pressing him back into the seat as the canards made near-invisible adjustments to maintain optimal angle of attack. The airspeed tape climbed rapidly on the display, each knot pulling the aircraft closer to the moment it would leave the ground. At rotation speed, the pilot eased back on the stick. The nose rose with a smoothness born from hours of fly-by-wire refinement, the main wheels lifting from the tarmac in a clean brake. The landing gear retracted almost as soon as the wheels cleared the ground, their bay doors sealing flush with the fuselage to preserve the aircraft's stealth profile. Outside, the world dropped away, the landscape tilting as the mighty Dragon clawed skyward. The climb rate was aggressive, but not reckless. Every angle, every degree of bank was calculated to keep the aircraft invisible to any radar lobe that might be sweeping the area. The first thing the pilot noticed as the altitude increased was how little turbulence was transmitted through the controls. The aerodynamic shaping of the fuselage, the precise deflection of the control surfaces, and the inherently stable platform meant that even in climbing turns, the jet felt as though it was gliding on rails. This was by design. The J-20's delta wing configuration provided a large surface area for lift, while the forward canards gave it agility that defied its size. These surfaces worked in harmony, manipulated by a quadruple redundant flight control system that could interpret thousands of data points per second, adjusting not just for pilot input, but for airflow distortion, angle of attack, and even sudden shifts in center of gravity. Midway through the climb, the pilot switched to supercruise mode. Unlike most fourth-generation fighters that required afterburners to maintain supersonic speed, the J-20 could sustain it without guzzling fuel in massive plumes of infrared visible exhaust. This not only extended its range, but also reduced its thermal signature, a crucial factor when evading advanced infrared search and track systems. At high altitude, this efficiency meant the difference between being able to loiter near contested airspace or having to retreat to a tanker for refueling. And in modern combat, the longer you can remain on station, the greater your strategic advantage. The avionics suite began its work without prompting. The AESA radar remained in passive scan, listening for the faintest electromagnetic whispers, while the IRST system swept the sky ahead, searching for heat signatures against the cold backdrop of the upper atmosphere. This combination meant that even without announcing its presence, the mighty Dragon could build a picture of the battle space. On the central display, icons began to populate, not just dots, but data-rich symbols showing altitude, vector, and probable identification. The pilot didn't have to guess which contacts were civilian airliners and which were potential threats. The fusion system was already ranking them by priority. As the jet leveled off at cruising altitude, the canopy offered an unobstructed panorama of the layered clouds below and the fading blue above. From here, the curvature of the Earth was faint but undeniable. The air was thinner, the sky darker, and the temperature outside plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed skin instantly. Yet inside the cockpit, environmental systems maintained perfect conditions. The pilot's suit and helmet provided additional safety margins. But it was the life support integration that allowed him to focus entirely on the mission rather than physical discomfort. The route ahead took the aircraft toward a zone of interest marked only in the secure mission briefings. No contrails would be left behind. The J-20's flight profile and altitude had been chosen to avoid visible vapor trails that could betray its position to ground observers or surveillance satellites. Even small details like engine throttle modulation were factored into stealth. Excess heat spikes from rapid acceleration could appear on thermal sensors hundreds of kilometers away, so changes in power were smoothed into gradual, almost imperceptible increments. The pilot glanced at the EW panel where the electronic warfare suite continued its silent watch. If any radar beam even grazed the aircraft, the system would not only detect it, but also identify its type, frequency, and likely source platform. In training exercises, this had allowed J-20 pilots to map out entire enemy search patterns without ever transmitting a single pulse themselves. The ability to see without being seen was more than a slogan. It was an operational doctrine that shaped every moment of flight. In the distance, the heads-up display marked a region of electromagnetic activity, faint, irregular, but persistent. It could be nothing more than civilian radar bleed, or it could be the outer edge of a defensive network. The fusion system cross-referenced the signal with satellite data and previous sorties, narrowing down possibilities. The pilot didn't alter course yet, but the awareness tightened his focus. Somewhere ahead, the mission's real work would begin. Every subtle vibration through the airframe, every shift in wind noise over the canopy was processed in the background by both man and machine. The climb was over, but the transition to the operational phase had just begun. The mighty Dragon was now in its element, high, fast, and silent, carrying the promise of what it could unleash when the moment came. And as the target zone inched closer on the display, the pilot's hands settled more firmly on the controls, ready for whatever would appear next out of the empty sky. The digital map projected across the central display showed the target area as a faint polygon, its boundaries traced in subtle green lines that pulsed softly against the dark background. The mighty Dragon's nose was pointed directly toward it, closing the distance at a speed that seemed almost deceptive. From inside the cockpit, the world moved in silence, without the cinematic rush of wind or roaring engines. At altitude, the sensation of speed was replaced by the steady, predatory approach of a hunter who knew it could strike without being seen. The pilot's gaze swept across his instruments, each one quietly confirming that the aircraft was still wrapped in its cloak of invisibility. The fusion of sensors painted a picture of the battlespace far beyond the range of human sight. A faint heat bloom, barely distinguishable from background noise, flickered on the IRST display. The algorithms recognized it instantly, not just a contact, but a potential point of interest, cross-matching it with archived patterns from previous missions. A civilian transport wouldn't move this way. A weather balloon wouldn't give off that kind of signature. The onboard AI didn't speak, didn't need to. It simply marked the contact, fed new calculations into the navigation system, and adjusted threat priorities without asking permission. The pilot's hands made small corrections on the stick, guiding the J-20 into a position that would keep it outside the enemy's primary radar lobes. Down below, the terrain shifted from flat expanses to jagged ridges, valleys, and scattered settlements. Even from this distance, the pilot could pick out glints of sunlight on metal, perhaps radio towers, perhaps air defense installations. The stealth geometry of the aircraft meant it could skirt far closer to these areas than conventional jets, but there was no reason to tempt fate. The path of approach had been planned to exploit terrain masking, using the contours of the Earth itself as a shield, a technique as old as aviation, but perfected here with satellite precision and real-time updates. As the J-20 slipped into the outer edge of the target zone, the weapons bays remained firmly shut. This wasn't a strike mission. The priority was intelligence, collecting data without leaving so much as a whisper in the electronic ether. The nose-mounted electro-optical sensor turret began its sweep, high-resolution lenses locking onto points of interest and capturing imagery that could be analyzed frame by frame back at base. Simultaneously, the electronic support measures reached deeper into the spectrum, sniffing out radar emissions, communication bursts, and encrypted pulses. The jet's brain was building a library of signatures, cataloging them for future encounters, each byte of information as valuable as a missile kill in the right hands. A blip on the EW panel drew the pilot's eye. A new radar source had lit up somewhere beyond the horizon, stronger and more directed than the ambient background noise. The system automatically classified it as a probable fire control radar, meaning somewhere out there, someone was looking for something specific. But they weren't looking at him. Not yet. The J-20's stealth was holding, and in the world of modern aerial warfare, that meant control. The aircraft could choose whether to remain a ghost or to announce its presence in a flash of sudden violence. Today, it would remain a ghost. The pilot fed a slight roll input, the canards and control surfaces responding instantly to arc the jet into a new heading. He was threading between overlapping radar fields now, guided not by luck, but by the meticulously updated threat map on his display. Every turn, every altitude adjustment was a move on a chessboard the enemy didn't even know they were playing. The J-20's engines purred steadily, their exhaust signatures diluted by altitude and the careful modulation of thrust that prevented the heat bloom from spiking. To an infrared sensor on the ground, the jet would be just another patch of cold sky. The mission clock in the corner of the display ticked past the halfway mark. Data packets continued to build in the onboard memory banks. Images, frequencies, vector plots, electronic fingerprints. Each was a puzzle piece that could change the outcome of a future conflict. The mighty Dragon was not just gathering intelligence, it was rewriting the balance of power, one invisible pass at a time. Eventually, the pre-programmed exit vector flashed on the HUD. The pilot initiated a gentle turn away from the target zone, careful not to create a flight path that could be traced back toward his origin. The aircraft's systems began to compress and encrypt the gathered data, preparing it for secure transmission once they were beyond the reach of hostile intercepts. The sensors that had been scanning so intently now shifted focus to monitoring for pursuit, but the screens remained empty of threats. It was as if the mission had happened in a parallel world, one that the enemy's eyes could never penetrate. The descent back toward home airspace was gradual, unhurried. The Mighty Dragon's presence in the contested zone would remain nothing more than a gap in someone's radar logs, a blank space where there should have been a trace. Approaching the base, the pilot dropped to a lower altitude, the runway emerging from the landscape like a thin scar in the earth. The landing gear deployed with a muted thud, the doors closing behind them as if to conceal the machinery even in the final moments of flight. Touchdown came with the controlled precision of a machine that had been designed to do everything with purpose. The tires met the tarmac, the nose wheel aligned perfectly with the centerline, and the roar of the engines softened as reverse thrust slowed the jet to a crawl. The ground crew moved in quickly, their reflective vests bright against the muted skin of the aircraft. The canopy opened with the same quiet authority it had closed hours earlier, releasing the pilot back into the open air. As the Mighty Dragon rolled into the shelter of the hangar, its mission complete, there was no outward sign of what it had just accomplished. The data would be pulled, analyzed, and dissected in secure rooms far from the runway. Reports would be written, strategies adjusted, and somewhere defenses would unknowingly be rendered obsolete. The J-20 settled into stillness once more, its edges disappearing into shadow, waiting for the next time it would rise unseen into the skies. And when it did, no one on the other side would know until it was already too late.